Red and blue lights flashed against the Hamptons estate windows. Police sirens wailed outside. I stood in the grand foyer watching 14-year-old Jade smirk from across the room. I felt the heavy, unmistakable weight of Barbara's diamond brooch inside my son Leo's jacket pocket. They had planted it. They were framing my 8-year-old boy to protect their precious legacy. Have you ever been the outsider in a relationship where you knew you weren't wanted? Drop a comment below. Where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? I love hearing where our community is gathered. The panic never came. There was no racing heart, no breathless despair, no trembling hands. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was entirely clinical. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a shred of regret for the family I thought we were building, but there was only absolute icy clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and it was time to balance the ledger. I had roughly 4 minutes before the officers reached the front doors of the sprawling estate. 4 minutes to execute a transaction that would cancel their investment in my son's destruction and shift the liability back to its rightful owner. I walked back toward the dining table, my steps measured and perfectly even. Caleb was holding court at the head of the table, laughing at some joke, oblivious to the fact that his family's plan was about to spectacularly backfire. Jade's silver designer clutch sat unattended on the marble side table near the open terrace doors. I needed a distraction, something immediate and visceral. I picked up a heavy crystal water pitcher from the buffet and walked closely past Caleb's chair. With a slight calculated shift of my wrist, I clipped the edge of his full wine glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor with a sharp crack, sending a dark red stain sprawling across the expensive Persian rug. The entire room turned at the sound. Caleb jumped back, cursing loudly as he brushed furiously at his ruined trousers. Barbara gasped, signalling the waitstaff to rush over with white cloth napkins. In those 10 seconds of manufactured chaos, I knelt beside Leo. I slipped my hand into his small jacket pocket and extracted the cold, heavy diamond brooch. My movements were invisible, shielded perfectly by the commotion of the spilled wine and the scrambling staff. I stood up smoothly, walked directly to the marble side table, and unsnapped Jade's silver clutch. I dropped the brooch deep inside, snapping the clasp shut with a satisfying final click. The asset had been relocated. The liability was successfully transferred. I returned to my seat at the table just as the heavy oak front doors opened and 2 police officers stepped into the foyer. I sat perfectly still, my posture immaculate. I didn't ask why they were doing this. I didn't wonder how people who claim to love us could orchestrate such a calculated framing of an innocent child. Love had been a contract, a subscription service, and I realised in that exact moment I was footing the entire bill for a defective product. I watched Caleb smooth his trousers, entirely unaware that the narrative he thought he was masterfully controlling had already been rewritten by my hand. He looked at me, offering a reassuring, patronising nod. He thought I was the compliant partner, the silent investor in their version of family who would blindly accept whatever losses they deemed necessary. He thought I would simply absorb the damage to keep the peace. They weren't shocked by what they'd done to a child. Soon, they were going to be shocked that I'd stopped playing along. I folded my hands neatly in my lap, breathing evenly, just waiting for the audit to begin. As the officers conferred in hushed tones with the estate manager, I calculated the exact price of my belonging in this house. It wasn't a metaphor or a feeling. It was a literal, documented financial figure. For 2 years, I had been the sole, silent underwriter for their elite, untouchable lifestyle. I covered the lavish family trips to Aspen and Martha's Vineyard when Caleb claimed his funds were tied up in investments. I paid Caleb's so-called business overhead when his boutique consulting firm hit an extended slump. I even covered 14-year-old Jade's exorbitant private school tuition because Barbara insisted that public schools lacked the moral upbringing necessary for their social circle. I did it all because I believed it was an investment in our shared future. I was paying the exorbitant entry fee, hoping that being the perfect, reliable provider would eventually buy Leo a permanent, respected seat at their mahogany dining table. Looking back, outsiders might wonder why I stayed, Why endure the subtle daily exclusions, the condescending remarks, and the relentless financial drain? It is easy to judge the silence of someone trapped in a toxic ecosystem from the outside. But the truth is, the most effective prisons do not have iron bars or locked doors. They are built on the invisible chains of a survivor. When you are conditioned to believe that your worth is fundamentally tied to your utility and your financial contributions, you stop fighting the exploitation. You absorb the cost because you have been trained to accept helplessness as a mandatory condition of love. You convince yourself that the constant draining giving will eventually yield a return on investment. It is a psychological trap, an invisible leash that keeps you firmly bound to your abusers, making you desperately believe that enduring their unreasonable demands is the only logical way to secure a safe future for your child. I had swallowed that lie entirely. I had treated our relationship like a binding contract where I was the only one making consistent deposits. I thought if I just worked harder, if my architectural firm took on more prestigious clients, I could bridge the unbridgeable gap between my blood and theirs. But the ledger was always rigged against us. To them, my money was an absolute entitlement and my son was merely an inconvenience. Leo's gifted test scores and quiet, undeniable brilliance only threatened their carefully manufactured superiority. They didn't want a gifted outsider exposing the sheer mediocrity of their own bloodline. So they decided to liquidate him. They decided to label an 8-year-old boy a common thief to ensure Jade remained the undisputed, flawless heir to their manufactured prestige. I looked across the room at Leo, sitting quietly, completely unaware of the massive debt I had accumulated trying to buy him a family. I had been foolish to think I could purchase genuine loyalty. Now the invisible chains were permanently broken. There was no sadness left in my chest, no lingering desire for their validation or acceptance. The illusion of family had been completely stripped away, leaving only the cold, hard mechanics of a hostile takeover. I had funded their extravagant lives for 2 years. Tonight, I was foreclosing on the entire operation without a single ounce of mercy. Barbara stood up from the dining table, adjusting her expensive silk shawl with practiced, dramatic flair. She approached the 2 police officers with the absolute authority of a woman who genuinely believed the law worked exclusively for her, not the other way around. Officers, I am Barbara Sterling, she announced, her voice perfectly modulated and designed to carry across the expansive room. My family heirloom, a flawless diamond brooch passed down for 3 generations, is missing. It was last seen resting on the console table in the hallway. She turned her gaze deliberately, pointedly toward Leo. I absolutely despise making accusations in my own home, but we have an outsider with us tonight, a boy who attends public school. I have always maintained that public institutions simply do not provide the moral upbringing or the discipline required for civilized high society. I sat perfectly still, listening to her calculated speech. I didn't interrupt her performance. I didn't jump up to defend my son. I let her commit every single arrogant word to the official record. I watched her enthusiastically dig her own grave with every polished, poisonous syllable. Caleb leaned down next to my chair, his hand resting heavy and possessive on my shoulder. His voice was a low, conspiratorial whisper meant only for me. Maya, listen to me carefully, he said, deploying that smooth, gaslighting tone he had perfected over the years. Just have Leo apologise and hand it over. Kids make mistakes all the time. If he gives it back right now, I can talk mother out of pressing formal charges. We can keep this entirely quiet. Just protect the family brand, Maya, and we can keep the night running smoothly. He was actively asking me to plead guilty to a crime they had engineered. He wanted me to willingly sacrifice my son's innocence and future on the altar of their pristine reputation. An apology, I repeated, my voice completely devoid of any emotion or inflection. You want my 8-year-old son to apologise for stealing a diamond brooch. It's the easiest transaction, Caleb insisted, squeezing my shoulder tighter to emphasise his point. It minimises the damage to everyone involved. Be reasonable, Maya. Think of the long-term implications. I looked up at him, the man I had shared a home with, the man whose professional debts I had quietly cleared. I didn't see a partner anymore. I saw a massive liability that needed to be permanently erased from my portfolio. We will let the officers do their job, I said coldly, breaking his gaze. Caleb sighed heavily, shaking his head as if I were a difficult, stubborn client refusing a highly sensible merger. Don't make this harder than it has to be, he warned, stepping away to join his mother. The performance they were putting on was flawless. Barbara played the aggrieved matriarch. Jade played the shocked, innocent bystander scrolling on her phone. And Caleb played the reasonable, peacemaking mediator. They were entirely confident in their script. They were so blinded by their own perceived superiority that they completely failed to realise I had already audited their entire plan. I watched Officer Patricia Keene step forward, her official notebook in hand. She was the wild card. They hadn't accounted for an objective, sharp professional who didn't care at all about the Sterling family brand. We will need to search everyone's belongings, Officer Keene stated clearly. Standard procedure for reported theft in a closed environment. With the host's full consent and the signed waiver for security screening provided by the estate management, we are authorised to conduct a search of all personal items currently in this foyer. Barbara nodded approvingly, her trap fully set. Of course. Start with the boy's jacket. The spotlight was on. They were eagerly waiting for my son to be destroyed. I simply crossed my legs, smoothed my skirt, and waited for the execution of their downfall. Officer Keene approached Leo with measured steps. He looked up at her with confused eyes, but didn't flinch. He handed her his small navy jacket without being asked. The room fell into absolute silence. Barbara had a triumphant sneer playing at the corners of her mouth. Jade looked down at her phone, feigning complete boredom. Caleb watched with his arms confidently crossed, waiting for the inevitable outcome. Officer Keene systematically checked the left pocket. Empty. She checked the right pocket. Empty. She turned the jacket completely inside out. Nothing. The triumphant sneer instantly vanished from Barbara's face. Caleb's arms dropped to his sides. Check his shoes, Barbara snapped, her voice losing its cultured edge. Check everywhere. Officer Keene maintained her professional composure. The boy is clear, ma'am. As I stated, we will now proceed to check everyone else's belongings. Officer Keene, I interjected, stepping forward with a calm authority regarding the recurring thefts in this household. I have already provided your department with a sworn statement and a list of items previously reported missing by guests and family members. Given that the brooch was found in this specific clutch, I believe a thorough inspection of its contents is now legally warranted. Officer Keene nodded, her expression sharpening into that of a seasoned investigator. She unsnapped the clasp of Jade's silver clutch. As she methodically emptied the contents, the evidence, including the gold Rolex, the custom pearl earrings, and the platinum money clip spilled onto the table, it was no longer just a suspicion, it was a confirmed criminal record being laid bare. And looking at the horrified, distinctly guilty expressions on Caleb and Barbara's faces, the reality became instantly clear. They knew. The family had been actively protecting her. They had been covering up her crimes, paying off the right people, and keeping everything quiet to fiercely protect their pristine public image. The framing of my son wasn't just an act of petty jealousy, it was a strategic diversion. They desperately needed a scapegoat. They needed to pin the missing brooch on a public school outsider so the police wouldn't look too closely at the Sterling family's own rotten core. The prestige of the house began to permanently shatter right there in the grand foyer. The polished veneer of elite superiority cracked under the immense weight of hard, undeniable evidence. Officer Keene pulled out her radio to call for immediate backup. Jade began to cry. Loud, terrified sobs that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Barbara gripped the edge of a chair, looking as though she might actually faint. Caleb stared at the stolen inventory, watching his carefully constructed world completely collapse. The asset they had tried to protect was totally liquidated, and I hadn't even delivered the final blow. The officers began formally reading Jade her rights, the cold legal phrasing cutting through the room's acoustics. The other guests crowded into the grand foyer, whispering furiously. The Sterling family brand was actively hemorrhaging value by the second. Caleb rushed over to me, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Maya, please," he begged, his voice cracking with desperation. "You have to help us fix this. Talk to the police. Tell them it's a misunderstanding. We have to protect the family brand." I looked at him, feeling absolutely zero empathy. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, meticulously organised manila folder. I didn't hand it to Caleb. I walked past him and handed it directly to Officer Keane. "Officer, while you are conducting your investigation into the thefts, you might find these documents highly relevant," I stated clearly, ensuring the gathering crowd of elite guests could hear every word. Inside is a comprehensive, certified audit of the Sterling family's actual finances. It details exactly how I have been exclusively covering their estate mortgage, funding their failing business overhead, and paying for Jade's private tuition for the past 2 years. Gasps echoed through the audience. Caleb froze in place, his eyes widening in paralysing terror. "You will also find undeniable evidence of fraudulent commercial loans Caleb took out using my architectural firm's credentials without my authorization," I continued, my voice cold and precise. "This isn't just a family protecting a teenage thief. It is a completely bankrupt enterprise actively operating on corporate fraud. That's a lie. You signed those documents, Maya. You were the one authorizing the transfers." He spat back, his voice thick with a desperate, frantic denial. Barbara let out a strangled cry. "You little," she started. But she had absolutely no power left to project. This is the ultimate truth about their kind of perceived superiority. It is nothing but the illusion of power of an empty wallet. They wrap themselves in imported silk and inherited diamonds, projecting a flawless image of untouchable elite status, but it is a hollow facade rented entirely on borrowed money and stolen credit. They fundamentally believe their bloodline makes them inherently valuable, but when the financial backing is abruptly removed, their true, desperate nature is exposed. They are completely empty. They have no intrinsic value, no strong character, no solid moral centre to stand on when the money finally dries up. Their arrogance was never actual power. It was merely an expensive performance funded entirely by my labour. "Caleb," I said, looking directly into his panicked eyes, "your massive debt is being called in today. I have already contacted the bank. I have frozen all shared accounts, cancelled the credit lines, and instructed my legal team to file formal charges for the financial fraud by tomorrow morning." "Maya, no! You can't do this to us," he pleaded. I stepped back, out of his reach. This wasn't an act of revenge, I told him, my tone purely transactional. It was basic accounting. I am liquidating a highly toxic asset. I turned my back on him. I picked up Leo's hand, feeling the warm pulse of the only person in the room who actually mattered. I walked toward the front doors, stepping around the shattered glass and spilled wine. Behind me, the Hamptons estate was in total chaos. Officers were questioning Barbara, Jade was screaming, and Caleb was staring blankly at the folder that had just bankrupted his existence. They were utterly destitute, publicly shamed, and facing severe criminal charges. The house of cards had completely fallen, and I didn't look back to watch the dust settle. 4 months later, Leo and I sat at a small, scarred wooden table in the sunlit kitchen of our new, humble apartment in the city. There were no imported crystal chandeliers above us, no expensive Persian rugs beneath our feet, and no legacy antiques lining the walls. There was only quiet, the kind of profound, unbroken, beautiful peace that only comes when you finally clear a massive, suffocating debt from your soul. Caleb and his family were currently facing multiple federal and state indictments for fraud and grand larceny. The sprawling Hamptons estate was in the final, unglamorous stages of bank foreclosure, serving as the ultimate, undeniable proof that their prestige was nothing but a very fragile, incredibly expensive illusion. I didn't follow the ongoing court proceedings closely, nor did I care to read the tabloid coverage of their downfall. Justice, I had ultimately learned, was not about obsessively watching their destruction. Justice was simply the exact moment they no longer had the power or the access to disturb my peace. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee and watched Leo spread his intricate architectural drawings across the kitchen table, his gifted mind completely unburdened and free to create. For 2 long years, I had fallen deeply into the dangerous trap of the empty chair. I had looked at the elite, exclusive tables of the world and genuinely believed that if I just worked hard enough, paid enough money, and compromised enough of my own boundaries, I could somehow earn a permanent, respected seat for my son. But trying to buy a seat at a table that fundamentally despises you is a guaranteed fool's errand. You simply cannot purchase genuine belonging from people who exclusively trade in exclusion and status. If you are watching this right now, and you have spent a portion of your life feeling like you are perpetually existing on the margins, I need you to hear this message clearly. Stop trying to furiously prove your worth to people who are entirely committed to misunderstanding you. Stop exhausting your most precious resources, your money, your love, your time, your energy, to aggressively buy a seat at a table where you will only ever be served scraps and condescension. You are not a secondary character in their legacy. You are the lead architect of your own life. Do not ever let the illusion of their superiority make you feel small or inadequate. When you finally stop striving for the validation and approval of toxic people, you instantly take back your power. You reclaim your assets. You realize that the margins are not a place of sad exile. They are the strong, clear foundation where you can build something entirely new, something incredibly real, and something completely yours. I've come to realize that the hardest part of walking away isn't the complex logistics or the bitter legal battles. The hardest part is simply forgiving yourself for staying as long as you did. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to gently set yourself free from the heavy guilt of allowing yourself to be exploited. We don't owe our abusers our continued suffering, and we certainly don't owe them our silence. We owe it to ourselves and to our children to fiercely build a life where love is a given, not a calculated transaction. If this story hit home for you, share it with someone who deeply needs to hear that it's okay to finally put yourself and your kids first. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories on reclaiming your power.